In this video, we will talk about the menstrual cycle. First of all, we will understand what is the definition of menstrual cycle. So, the definition of menstrual cycle is the cyclical changes which takes place in the uterus during the reproductive phase of female primates. So, the definition of menstrual cycle is cyclical changes which take place in uterus during reproductive phase of female primates is called menstrual cycle. So these are the cyclical changes which are taking place in the uterus during the reproductive phase of female primates. So then what are female primates? Female primates are like monkeys, apes and human beings. These are the primates. The menstrual cycle is repeated in human being with an interval of 28 to 29 days. It's repeated with an average interval of 28 to 29 days. It may be variable plus or minus 2 days in some women. The menstrual cycle starts at puberty. That is called the menarche. So we may define menarche. Menarche is the onset of first menstrual cycle at puberty. Onset of first menstrual cycle at puberty is first menstrual cycle which takes place in the female is called the menarche, and which starts in the age of 12 to 15 years age, and this menarche happens in the age of 12 to 15 years of female, and this process starts from the menarche and it stops at menopause. It continues from menarche to menopause. Starting of menstrual cycle at the age of 12 to 15 years is called the menarche. But after attaining certain age, around 50 years, menstrual cycles are going to be stopped in the female, and that period is called the menopause. This process is start process, where menstrual cycle starts in the age of 12 to 15 years. But menopause is the stop of menstrual cycle around the age of 50 years. And a female attains 50 years, so there will be no menstrual cycle, and that stage is called the menopause. So menstrual cycle has divided into 4 phases. The cycle has divided, we can study the menstrual cycle with the help of 4 phases. So before we study the detail of menstrual cycle phases, one thing I want to share with you, that is the usage of many hormones in this process. So here 2 sets of hormones are going to be useful in this process. The one set of hormones are pituitary hormones. Pituitary hormones are there. And other set of hormones are called the ovarian hormone. Ovarian hormones. Pituitary secretes two gonadotropins. They are LH and FSH. These are two hormones are influencing many events of menstrual cycle. In the same way, ovary also secreting two hormones. One is estrogen and progesterone. So these two are called the female sex hormone. Their role is very important in menstrual cycle process. How they are going to be influenced during the process we will study while we are discussing the events of menstrual cycle. Let us see the first phases of menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle has 4 phases. Phases of menstrual cycle. So we already know there are 4 phases are there. First one is called the menstrual phase. Menstrual phase, which starts from first day to 5th day of menstrual cycle. The period of menstrual cycle is 1st to 5th day of menstrual cycle. What are the events or changes takes place during menstrual phase? We will discuss later. The second phase is follicular phase. Follicular phase, which is also called the proliferative phase, or we may also use one more word for this phase, that is pre-ovulatory phase. And this period takes place between the 6th day to 13th day of menstrual cycle. The period for follicular phase is 6th day to 13th day of menstrual cycle. And third phase is ovulatory phase. Ovulatory phase. It's not actually a phase, it's a process which takes place in one particular day, and that is the 14th day. Ovulatory phase is also called the ovulation. So the 14th day, this happens only 14th day in those women who have 28 days menstrual cycle. Otherwise, it may happen 15th or 16th day also. The fourth event or phase is luteal phase. Luteal phase, or it may also called secretory phase, or it may also called the post-fertilization phase. Post-ovulation phase. Post-ovulation phase. And the period of this phase is 15th day to 28th day of menstrual cycle. So, hence we used to call this every menstrual cycle will take 28 days. It may be different period in different women, but normally we say 28 days are required to complete one menstrual cycle. Now we'll discuss each and every phases with their characteristic features or the events which are taking place during that period. Let us start with the first phase, that is menstrual phase. So as we already know, menstrual phase starts from first day itself until 5th day of menstrual cycle. And this phase happens in absence of the pregnancy. It happens in absence of pregnancy. Means if the egg is fertilized, it starts developing into embryo. That period we call the gestation period or pregnancy period. If the woman is in gestation period or pregnancy period, menstruation is not there or menstrual phase is not seen. And appearance of menstrual cycle indicates that so there is no pregnancy. So but sometimes what happens during the stress or poor health or condition also, menstrual cycle is absent. So the next character is, the characteristic feature of this event or phase is, so there is a rupturing of endometrium wall and that leads to the discharge of menstrual discharge. Menstrual discharge or menesis. Menstrual discharge comes out of the uterus through the vagina, which we also call the menesis, and this menstrual discharge contains mucus, cellular debris, and also blood shed of internal lining of uterus. So this menstrual discharge contains so all these things, and amount of menstrual discharge will be 50 to 400 ml. So the amount of menstrual discharge will be 50 to 400 ml. So in menstrual phase, what are the things are happening? We may go through one more time. The period of menstrual phase is 1st to 5th day of menstrual cycle, and this phase takes place only in the absence of pregnancy. When there is no pregnancy, then only the period appears. And during this process, endometrium wall ruptures or degenerates and it will come out in the form of menstrual discharge or menesis. And this menstrual discharge containing mucus, cellular debris and also bloodshed of internal lining of uterus. And amount of menstrual discharge will be 50 to 400 ml. So the next event is follicular phase. Second event or phase of menstrual cycle is follicular phase. Follicular phase, or we may also call the proliferative phase. We may also call the proliferative phase. This phase takes place during 6th to 13th day of menstrual cycle. The period of follicular phase is 6th to 13th day of menstrual cycle. That's why we used to call this is the free ovulatory phase, because ovulation takes place on the 14th day. So the follicular phase completes within that period, hence it is also called the free ovulatory phase. So during this phase, the primary follicles are maturing as Graafian follicle in ovary by the influence of FSH. So in ovary, primary follicles are maturing as a Graafian follicle. They are becoming Graafian follicle, and this event happens only because of hormone FSH. The FSH influence for the growth of Graafian follicle from primary follicle, and this process takes place inside the ovary. At the same time, in uterus, there is a regeneration of uterine epithelium by proliferation. There is a regeneration of uterine epithelium by proliferation. And this process takes place by the influence of hormone estrogen. This process takes place by the influence of hormone estrogen. So simultaneously there are two events in two places of female reproductive system during follicular phase, that is 6th to 13th day. In ovary, primary follicles are getting mature or becoming Graafian follicle, and in uterus, regeneration of uterine epithelium takes place by the proliferation. Here FSH is influencing this process, and in uterus estrogen is influencing this process. And during this period one more thing is there, that is the concentration of LH and FSH increasing gradually. So these are the changes which are there during follicular phase. The next phase is ovulatory phase. Ovulatory phase. So which happens on the 14th day of menstrual cycle. During this period, so already there is a concentration of an LH and FSH reaches their peak level, and attaining of peak level of LH is called the LH surge. And the concentration of LH reaches its peak level or maximum level, and that stage is called the LH surge. This LH surge induces the rupturing of Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle is rupturing, and this Graafian follicle, after rupture, it releases the secondary oocyte. It releases the secondary oocyte, which is collected by the fimbriae and enters the fallopian tube. This process is called the ovulation. This process is called the ovulation. So then what is the ovulation? Ovulation is nothing but release of secondary oocyte from Graafian follicle due to LH surge on the 14th day of menstrual cycle. So these are the events which take place on the 14th day of menstrual cycle, and this phase is called the ovulatory phase. And the fourth phase is luteal phase or secretory phase. Fourth phase is luteal phase. Or secretory phase, which also called the post-ovulatory phase also, because these are the changes are taking place after ovulation. And period for luteal phase is from 15th day to 28th day of menstrual cycle. So the 15th to 28th day of menstrual cycle period we call as a luteal phase. So characteristic feature of this phase are, so the vascularization and thickening of uterine epithelium takes place. The first character is the uterine epithelium is becoming thickened. Is the thickness of the endometrium wall layer is increasing, and also vascularization. Vascularization means it receiving more blood. Due to receiving more blood and thickening, increase in the thickness. So the endometrium wall thickness is increasing. This is the first event which is taking place during luteal phase. And at the same time, the Graafian follicle which has ruptured during ovulation is transforming into corpus luteum. So Graafian follicle which has ruptured and released the secondary oocyte. Now it has becoming as a corpus luteum. This corpus luteum is a temporary endocrine gland and that secretes the hormone progesterone. And this progesterone maintains the endometrium wall. It maintains the endometrium wall. If there is a fertilization, the corpus luteum persists. If fertilization not takes place, corpus luteum is going to be degenerated as corpus albicans. Corpus luteum is degenerating as corpus albicans. And concentration of progesterone and estrogen is decreasing and that causing degeneration of endometrium wall and that leads to the menstruation. And the cyclical changes which are taking place during the reproductive phase are continuing from menarche to the menopause. This is indicative of normal reproductive phase. So these are the events which are divided into 4 phases. Now we can draw a diagram based on these events so we can understand clearly how this process takes place. So now let us draw the diagrammatic representation of all these events of menstrual cycle. Already we have discussed all the events which are taking place during the different phases. So here we can see the diagrams of all those events. So in the first event what we have studied during menstrual phase, the menstrual phase starts from 1st to 5th day, during which what happens, the menses takes place or menstrual discharge takes place from uterus to the vagina, which contains the cellular debris, mucus and bloodshed of internal lining of endometrium. That we have shown with this diagram. At the same time, in the ovary, the few follicle cells are there and among this one follicle is differentiating itself into, it starts differentiating primary follicle. So that event takes place in this period. So the next step, I already mentioned that there are 2 sets of hormones are involved. One set is ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone. One set is pituitary hormones, one is LSH and FSH. So how their concentration increase and decrease we can notice with this diagram. So before 14th day, concentration of LH, FSH and estrogen is very high. But after ovulation, the concentration of LH and FSH decreases and only estrogen and progesterone concentration increases. So here by this line we can understand their levels of concentration before ovulation and after ovulation. So next phase is we call as a follicular or proliferative phase, which starts from 6th to the and it continues 30th day of menstrual cycle. Here also we can notice the events, one event in ovarian side or inside the ovary, other events inside the uterus. Inside the ovary, what the changes which are taking place? These primary follicles are maturing into Graafian follicle. So sequentially, primary follicle to secondary follicles, tertiary follicles, and later they become as a Graafian follicle, the one which is mature follicle. And at the same time, in uterus we also notice certain events. Here the proliferation of endometrium wall takes place under the influence of estrogen. So at exact 14th day, here the Graafian follicle ruptures and a secondary oocyte release, and that process we call as a ovulation, which takes place on the 14th day due to the LH surge. LH surge means already we know when concentration of LH and FSH reaches their peak point. That period is called the LH surge and that happens at the 14th day of menstrual cycle, and that induces the rupturing of Graafian follicle and the process is called the ovulation. So after ovulation, the next stage is called the luteal phase or secretory phase. So here also we can notice the events. Some events may take place inside the ovary and some events may take place inside the uterus. Inside the ovary, what are the things which are going to be happen? Here the ruptured Graafian follicle transforms into corpus luteum, and this corpus luteum acts as a temporary endocrine gland and it secretes the hormone progesterone. The concentration of progesterone reaches very high after the 15th day or ovulation, and this progesterone is useful for the maintaining of endometrium wall. And suppose if there is a fertilization is there, corpus luteum persists throughout the gestation period. If there is no fertilization, corpus luteum slowly regress or degenerate into corpus albicans. At the same time, here we can notice in the uterus. In uterus, the uterine epithelial cells are vascularizing and they are thickening, and at the same time the uterine glands are enlarging and they are coiling and they are secreting certain mucus and uterine milk, which is going to be used by the embryo during early development. So if the fertilization not happens, so progesterone estrogen level decreases, and again the next menstrual cycle starts with the initiation of menses. So what are the events we have discussed during the explanation of menstrual cycle? So all those events we have drawn here and we have understood by this flow chart or diagrammatic representation. So I hope you understood. So here we are going to conclude this process. In the next class we will continue. So another segment of human reproduction.